Hello, everybody. Welcome to hopefully with what is hopefully the first of many virtual webinars that we will have discussing meaningful topics. Thanks for attending. This event has been brought to you by YouOkayDoc. YouOkayDoc is a registered UK charity, and the charity is focused on doctors' mental health, and it's really focusing on empowering and providing mental health support and well-being empowerment for doctors. However, right now, we also appreciate that there is a global need for support, and we all need listening and learning opportunities. So the huddle is usually a listening and learning opportunity for doctors, but what we've decided to do is open this out to the wider general public and for all first responders and for all of you that have tuned in today, because we recognize we all need opportunities to calm down and, like I said, listen and learn. So we're incredibly happy for you all to be here this evening and to join us with Chris Cherry and Mike Fisher. Now, a little bit about our panelists this evening. So Chris is our founding trustee of YouOkayDoc. He is a qualified psychotherapist with over 30 years of experience. Registered with the UK Council of Psychotherapy, Chris has worked in the NHS, the Crown Prosecution Service, as well as a founding member of multiple organisations. So we're really, really happy that Chris will be hosting this session and sort of many of our future sessions too. And on to our guest speaker for this evening, Mike Fisher. So Mike Fisher is an esteemed therapist and author and a leading authority on anger management and trauma incident therapy. Amongst many of his achievements, he is the founder of the British Association of Anger Management and the Centre for Men's Development in London. So happy to have you on this evening, Mike and Chris. Now, before I move on and kick off the evening, I'm going to do a bit of that old hygiene check. So we are recording this evening's session and also live on Facebook. Your cameras are switched off because it's a webinar, but if you do have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to put your questions into the chat box. Please, if it's a Q&A question for the latter part of the session, please prefix that with a Q so I don't miss it. That would be really helpful because that chat box get busy. In addition, when the session ends, you will be asked to fill out a quick survey. So please do take a moment to complete that survey. It's only about 5 to 6 questions. It will really help us form the foundations of content and speakers for the up-and-coming 6-part webinar series, which launches in the second week of June. So that's really exciting. In terms of format for this evening, Mike and Chris will kick off in a few short minutes. The session will run for approximately 90 minutes or so. Although it was advertised for 60 minutes, there's just so much stuff to talk about, and we wanted to give both Mike and Chris enough opportunity and also enough an opportunity to answer your questions too. So if you feel like you do need to drop out post the hour, totally fine, totally understand. But if you can stay, we're happy to have you. So the first 30 minutes will be a session with Chris and Mike. Then at 7:45, we will open for questions. Now, at 8 o'clock, because it is a Thursday, we will take a short moment to clap for our carers. And at that point, I will unmute everybody, and we just want to hear your raging cheer from all parts of the country or the world, wherever you're tuning in from. And then post that, about 8:02 or 8:03, Chris will lead us back into a Q&A session and continue to answer some of your questions. So we're hoping to be wrapped up between 8:20 and 8:30. If you can stay with us for the full 90 minutes, amazing. Now, just a quick note, we are a charity. This is a completely complimentary event, and we want to keep on supporting and creating these events. So please do feel free, if you can and you are open to, you can text donate throughout the session or later. I will put the text donation details into the chat box as well. Okay, well, that's enough from me. Thank you so much. And finally, I will hand over to Chris, who will kick off our session. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Mike, welcome. I'm getting a little bit of echo. Welcome. I mean, Angie sort of gave a good sort of introduction, but on my own sort of experience of you, we worked together in the 90s. We set up the Men's Centre in London, which I think was also part of the catalyst for you setting up anger management, the first real sort of service in the UK to provide understanding and work around the important issue of anger management. And I think that started in 2000, didn't it? So that's 20 years you've been anger management. I'm also very aware that quite a number of people listening in tonight, watching, are people that know you directly, either through the work they've done with you, or the books that you've read, the things that they've read or seen, because you've done quite a few documentaries, you've been on TV, etc. So it's great for you to, well, in fact, you're the first speaker for the webinar series that we hope will continue for many years to come, and it'll be great that you will join us, I think, again in June. If I could kick off, the title of the webinar is "Standing in the Fire with Kindness." Just explain a little bit about what standing in the fire means. What made you think of that title?
So let's go back a few steps. Of course, it's great to be here, and it's great to be working with you again. You know, we spent many years together running a men's group and working very closely in the context of the Centre for Men's Development. You know, part of the conversation that you and I had recently was looking at what seems to be fundamental within the context of anger management. And I also know that the conversation that you and I had is next week is going to be Mental Health Week, and the theme is kindness. We spoke about something else coming up in June, which had to do with adversity. So as soon as the theme kindness came up, my eyes sparkled, and the reason for that, of course, is because I'm a big promoter of be as angry as you want to be. That's important, be as angry as you want to be, but at the same time, you need to be kind.
Did you say be as angry as you want to be?
Yes.
Okay.
But you can also be kind, which then raises the question, what is anger?
Yeah.
Well, most people's experience is to use. And it's in suck it in and see one of the that's what we do. We suck it in.
Mike, we've got a bit of a problem with the internet.
Sorry, I didn't hear that, Chris.
You've come back, Mike. The last few minutes,
yes.
Your signal went.
So I might just let me just go back a few steps. Just keep in mind, I'm in Spain, even though I'm on fiber optic. There's millions of people in Zoom right now.
Yes.
So basically, the British culture is a culture of imploders, and the issue is that people think anger is all about screaming, shouting, and hurling abuse, which essentially is the exploder. So there's this challenge, or there's this difference between what it means to be an imploder and an exploder. And within the context of what I'm teaching, I always say to people, it's much better, it's much healthier to express your anger, because if you don't express your anger, you end up becoming depressed. And I imagine, some of the attendees would probably recognize that themselves. So from where I'm sitting, I'm saying, be as angry as you want to be, but you can also be kind, which raises a lot of questions. Well, what does it mean to be angry? And so the idea of bringing kindness into the equation is both thought-provoking and also challenging, because most often when people are angry, there's nothing kind about their actions or behaviors, thoughts, or feelings. So that's where, from a thematic perspective, that's where it came from.
I mean, in the context of, the charity being about emotional and mental well-being for doctors, what would you see that Standing in the Fire being about specifically for doctors at this moment in time? Would you say it's all of us are having to deal with the COVID, the virus. I suppose I see it partly Standing in the Fire at the moment is literally dealing with the fierceness, the energy of the virus, and the sort of energy that's needed by doctors and health practitioners to cope with, to manage, to respond to the virus. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. So, I remember part of the conversation that we had is last week or the week before is, they are in the front line, they are in the trenches. I have no idea what is actually going on in hospitals, other than it must be pretty darn scary, traumatic, and highly, highly stressful. And that's what I mean by standing in the fire with kindness, because they also have to find ways, and I'm not just talking about doctors, of course, I'm also talking about nurses and administrators. They need to find a way of standing in the fire and at the same time dealing with whatever is thrown at them. One of the things we already know about is the PPE, not having sufficient equipment to protect themselves. And we also know that over 200 members of staff from the NHS have already died because of the virus. And, I think that's a pretty brave thing to do. So under the circumstance of being in the situation that they're in, there's something about, and, I talk about this often in my work, there's something about what we have to do is we have to delay gratification and sit in the discomfort of our feelings. Because they're dealing with such high levels of stress and anxiety. And all I do is I see that in the pictures. The pictures themselves tell some of the story, but what I'm not exposed to is, the profound sense of grief, the profound sense of tragedy, emergency, high levels of anger, high levels of stress, high levels of profound fear, sadness, etc. And how do you cope with something like that? I mean, this is not about bullets being fired at you. This is about something which is invisible that's impacting all of us.
Mm-hmm. So about kindness, what do you mean by the word kindness?
Well, that was one of the questions that was asked of us earlier on, and so whoever asked that question, I really appreciate that. And I think the only way I can describe what it means to be kind is by being gentle on myself and by being gentle on others, by recognizing the situation I find myself in and the effect and the impact that's having on me. So how do I manage that? I can use that situation to act my anger out, or I can use that situation to act my anger in. What I mean by that is turning my anger in on myself.
So just on that, so what would it look like if it's anger outwards? What
well, anger outwards, look, in the conversation that you and I have had before, Chris, we've had the privilege of working with so many doctors and nurses and ministers staff from the NHS over the last, in fact, 20, 21 years. And these are individuals who have these huge hearts, are extraordinarily committed, dedicated, and generous. But at the same time, they're also incredibly and profoundly human. So they suffer like everyone else suffers from all sorts of things that life throws at us. So within the context of what we're talking about, there's an outward focus. And they are, as you already know, and this is my experience, is they are perfectionists. They like the environment to be as professional and as organized and as efficient as possible. So a lot of doctors and surgeons that I've worked with, including nurses, find it incredibly frustrating when they're actually having to deal with all sorts of issues that they're faced with on an ongoing basis. And the big theme, the political perspective, is all about it being underfunded. And I don't really, and I've already discussed, we don't want to get into the political stuff. We want to get into how do people manage high levels of stress? How do we manage when somebody's angry with us, or when we have a patient that is screaming or shouting, or maybe a patient's relative or loved one who is so distressed because they're not getting the kind of care that they need? How do they deal with the levels of stress and anxiety? And so they have to find a way of managing their own distress. And one of the things that I'm very, very aware of is how desensitized they've become in order to manage that level of intensity.
When you say desensitized, you mean, I kind of know what you mean, but just remind me.
Sure. So what I mean by that is they have to disassociate from feeling. They have to cut off from feeling.
Right.
They have to become kind of like an automated machine. And yet that's not who they are. They're extraordinary human. And they have extraordinary sense of feeling, responsibilities, duties, and commitment to their patients, and to their profession. So how do they manage that? Is to disassociate emotionally, disconnect. And by disconnecting, our experience working with doctors and nurses, and I want to include administrative staff, is by disconnecting, that helps them to function. But the question is, does it really? Because what do they do with the intensity of whatever it is that they feel? And, some of the conversations I've had with people, doctors and nurses who attended our programs, is they suck it in their professional life and they take it home and dump it.
Do you think, because you're just reminding me about fight, flight, and freezing, is that a sort of variation of that sort of idea?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to have to give me a moment to answer that, because I really like that question. Look, I think on some level it is a derivative of fight, flight, freeze. Mm-hmm. But I think it's far more, I don't even know what the word is, far more challenging. Mm-hmm. Because keeping in mind, fight, flight, freeze is a classical biological way of dealing with high levels of anger, rage, fury, and of course high levels of fear and terror. Mm-hmm. The environment that we're talking about, even though it might have elements of that, in order to manage what they're managing, I don't think is just necessarily fight and flight. But I do think it's about disassociation from feeling and becoming very much like a machine, just getting the task done, not necessarily even seeing the patient as a patient. Mm-hmm. Not seeing the patient in their humanity, but seeing that they have a responsibility and a duty to saving a life or releasing them from pain and suffering.
I mean, it would be good to hear some comments from people who are actually working in those environments to see their own thoughts and reflections. But one of the things you just reminded me, Mike, is this whole idea, and it's beginning to gain sort of traction, is about post-traumatic stress disorder, and that this is a perfect storm for practitioners working in those environments. But the PTSD doesn't really start to become visible for several months. But in terms of kindness to oneself, are there preventative things that are possible to do with a certain sort of awareness or consciousness, or do you think it's inevitable because of the situation?
Well, great question. Just let me go back a few steps, because you see, what we're talking about here is not post-traumatic stress that will occur at some point in the future. Mm-hmm. What we're talking about is traumatic stress in the moment by moment. And so that's really what needs to be addressed immediately within the context of the environment that they're working in.
And do you think it's inevitable? I mean, do you think it's just a natural consequence of what people are having to do? I suppose there must be some just inevitability to it. But is there things that one can attend to with a certain sort of awareness and consciousness to minimize some of that trauma?
Yes. So I get the question loud and clear, but I do want to just say something which is around. If you look at that environment, there are high levels of doctors who are already experiencing depression. There are high levels of doctors who are already experiencing the fallout. So this is not as if it's going to happen, post the virus where everything settles down. It's happening right now. As you and I are talking, it's happening.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, remind Mike. I mean, YouOkayDoc was set up because of the stats for mental health, suicide rates, etc. for doctors is shockingly high. So you've just reminded me of that anyway, irrespective of the virus.
Well, I tell you what I'm curious about, Chris, is those stats. I mean, do you have access to any of those stats right now as you sit there? Because I'm curious about that.
I mean, I can get them. I mean, Ange could send some over. They're on the website. But the BMJ, they've published quite a few stats. They've done a bit, and the BMA as well. But I mean, Ange can send me over the specifics. But they are remarkably high. They're certainly much higher than the general population.
Yes. And why I ask the questions, because I'm curious about the stats today as we sit here. As a studio, 10 years, is that the stats to keep increasing, irrelevant of the virus, is my view. Having said that, it's a story that I tell. But I am curious about that. But coming back to how do they? Is also open to the public, but how do we find ways of actually dealing with and managing those levels of distress? And to all of you listening, what I did prior to this presentation, I did look at a conversation that Chris and I had a couple of weeks ago around, I talk about being kind, and when I talk about being kind, I'm talking about not just being kind to others, but it's also about being kind to myself. And Chris, you reminded me of that. I thought, very valid point. So how can we be kind? So what I did is that I went through a list of what I thought, based on my experience of working with doctors and of course any other individuals who are not kind to themselves when they're angry. And that's something that maybe we can work through, Chris, and then, we can just bounce ideas off each other. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So one of the points that I think is important is self-care. The issue with doctors and nurses and individuals who are part of the health and mental health profession and the care profession, there is such a focus on everybody else and focus on care of them, but the idea of self-care doesn't even come into their awareness. And so they have to constantly be reminded of what it means to take care of yourself. And so part of that process is, one is to make themselves a priority. Now, the idea of making yourself a priority is a foreign concept. And when I talk about stress, and this is a conversation we had earlier on when you and I were talking, is the problem with most people who experience high levels of stress are not the priority in their own lives. And so it's about how do you make yourself a priority. And then, of course, as you know, what will happen is if I make myself a priority, somebody will tell me that I'm being selfish. But actually, my view is it's not about being selfish, it's about being self-preserving. It's one of the ways that we preserve ourselves. Because if we can't be there for ourselves, how can we be there for others? So by being a priority and taking care of myself and putting myself first gives me the space to nourish myself, to regenerate, so that when I go back into the combat zone, and I think, I imagine that environment is probably like a combat zone, it's that you're actually prepared and you're ready to do what needs to be done. But if you're running on empty, your ability to be professional, efficient, stay focused, be emotionally contained without acting up is not easy.
Yeah.
That's one of the points that I wanted to make, and I'm curious what your response might be.
What's your when you talk about selfishness, which I completely understand? I mean, I see that as a positive rather than a negative. What sort of things would you give as examples of what people could do that they might see as
in terms of
self-care? Yeah, let's move away from just self-care, attention to oneself. What would be the sort of thing?
Get enough sleep, get enough exercise, eat healthy, monitor the amount of alcohol, cigarettes, coffee. So it's just having an all-round awareness within the context of body, mind, and spirit. And I think most of us know what's healthy for us and what's not healthy for us. But there is something to be said when we're under high levels of stress. There is overconsumption as a way of managing our distress.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that we can do. That's part and parcel of making ourselves the priority and self-care. Now, if you're as lazy as I am, I've got to kind of push through my laziness to get the exercises that I need. In fact, I was weighing myself this morning. In the last 2 months, I put on an extra 4 kilograms. It's like, what? It's just ridiculous. So tomorrow I've got to start again. Nice, healthy regime, fitness regime. But it takes discipline to take care of myself because I spend so much of my time taking care of others. And I'm part of, the health and care profession. And it's pretty crazy right now. So there's a discipline and a commitment to oneself to nourish oneself in order to be available to those who desperately in need. So those are one of the ways that I would suggest.
I mean, one of the other things I've always thought about is the sheer kind of intensity of adrenaline that must be constant. And I think that's also got some links to PTSD or even just trauma in the moment. And how do you move from a very highly adrenalized environment to is a way to do it consciously, because we're creatures of mood, aren't we? So even in a state of adrenaline, we're very alive. We're kind of fizzing in all sorts of ways. And I can imagine sort of consuming whatever the sort of things you've talked about, or keeping that adrenaline going, as opposed to beginning to kind of consciously sort of manage it to bring it to calming it a bit. But of course, if you're straight back into it the next day, that sort of adrenaline is quite difficult to kind of manage it, isn't it?
Well, look, my direct experience is that when you're over-adrenalized, or what I would describe as having an overstimulated central nervous system or central cortex, one of the things we have to do is, in order to get to sleep, we have to absolutely exhaust ourselves.
Yeah.
And I've spent years and years doing just that, exhausting myself in order to get to sleep. So that's one of the things we've got to stop doing, is discipline ourselves to getting to bed early. I think that's important, to get as much sleep as we possibly can under the circumstances. But there is also things about, there's something to be said about actually taking time out for myself. So if the time out is to go for long walks, or if the time out is to get exercise, or if the time out is to meditate, mindful practice, yoga, those are the ways that we start, to slow down that overstimulation and that rush of adrenaline. But having said that, Chris, I mean, what you're raising is, and I don't know if we're kind of going off this here, but there's something about addiction to adrenaline. Yep. So there is something about how the adrenaline gives us our life meaning. Now remove the adrenaline, and then what do we have instead of that? Tranquility, relaxation, peace, and quiet. And for so many people I work with, and I think it's true of people working in the NHS, is the idea of actually being able to relax, really relax.
Yeah.
It's not something that they're used to. And, once again, it just kind of reminds me why the charity was set up. Because one of the other things, of course, is having access to therapists like yourself, having access to services that they wouldn't usually reach out for. So I think there's something to be said about actually having a counselor or a psychotherapist that you can see as well. It's an hour that belongs to you. It doesn't belong to anybody else but you. You are the center of attention. Because in most of your working life, you're not the center of attention.
I mean, I was just getting some of the stats sent to me, and one of the stats, shocking, is 80% of burnout for doctors. So part of this, going back to the kindness, I mean, it's such a difficult, how you juggle being constantly adrenalized. And I think once you come off the adrenaline, then there's a whole range of different emotions that start to come into, you start to experience lots of things. And how you self-care, how you look after yourself in those moments, when you know that in a short period of time, you're going to be straight back in those environments, when in some ways the adrenaline is exactly the thing you need to be able to bear it, to cope, to be able to engage with it.
Yes.
Do you have more thoughts about self-care? I mean, the meditation decides that they're all, I mean, I think we all know that they're key to our own health, and yet they're quite difficult to be able to put into place.
Look, I think everything that we're talking about is self-care here. So, for example, some of the other examples that I'd like to present is what we've got to do is we've got to learn to say no. We've got to recognize our limitations, not go beyond our limitations. Because when you talk about adrenaline, you also need to talk about cortisol. And as you know, that cortisol is the body's own natural painkiller. But the problem with cortisol is when you have too much of it, a flooding of cortisol, that can also kill you. The problem with adrenaline is being over-adrenalized, that breaks down an immune system, which could also kill us or make us very ill. So they're constantly in a compromised situation with that level of intensity that they're actually dealing with today. And I don't even think, when it comes to this particular pandemic and these couple of months, I think they're in a constant state of adrenalization. And that's the statistic you just mentioned. For me, it's heartbreaking, man. Heartbreaking. 80% burnout. And I know about burnout, and I think a lot of people in our profession know about burnout. So there's learning to say no. And that's difficult when people's lives are at stake. But I think it is important that we learn to say no. And it is important for us to recognize our limitations. And I don't know whether doctors do know how to say no and do recognize the limitations by the very nature of what you talk about being over-adrenalized or being adrenalized, knowing when to actually put on the brakes. The other thing that I think is important here, and look, I'm being fairly factual because of the nature of this particular client group.
Yes, yeah.
There's something about a lot of the doctors that I work with which have low self-esteem. Whether they want to acknowledge it or not is a different conversation. But let me just very quickly mention, and it's interesting at the time, Chris, it's really 8:36, yeah? Very, very quickly mention this to you, that there is a difference and a distinction between self-esteem and confidence. Now, of course, doctors are very confident. They've had years and years and years of training, and they're darn good at what they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive in the system. It doesn't mean that they have healthy self-esteem. What am I talking about there? Self-esteem is to do with valuing myself, appreciating myself, supporting myself. Self-care is part of self-esteem, healthy self-esteem. Seeing ourselves as kind of fundamental in our own lives. And so on the basis of seeking approval or trying to prove themselves, those are stories that continuously come up in the work that I do with people in the health and care professions. So learning to say no, stop seeking approval, stop trying to prove yourself. You've already proved yourself. You already have the credibility. There's another way of taking care of yourself. And by the way, it's also another way of being kind to yourself. There are a couple of other things that Go ahead.
Well, just on that, so because some of what we focused on is behavior, sort of actions.
Yes.
And then in terms of what you just said there, the sort of thoughts that you'd associate with low self-esteem or self-worth, what would be the sort of thoughts that people would be having about themselves?
Well, look, I look at it from the perspective of when I listen to people who are constantly trying to prove themselves, one of the questions I ask, well, who are you trying to prove yourself to? Mm-hmm. And the obvious response is, oh, well, I think I'm still trying to prove myself to my father that I'm good enough. Or I'm trying to prove myself to my mother that I'm good enough. Or I'm trying to prove myself that I'm good enough, or that I'm enough. And I think that's part and parcel of what it means to have low self-esteem, is not feeling good enough, not feeling comfortable with who we are, not really trusting who we are in the world. So that's the way that I would describe it, even to the point of feeling that they're unlovable and constantly overcompensating for that. And it's really not unusual, as you already know, because that's what you also do with in your practice. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, what were you going to go on to?
Well, I was going to. I just wanted to say something about go back to recognizing our limitations, because I think one of the things that people who have low self-esteem do. It's interesting. I've kind of brought that dimension into it, which we've not discussed before, but I think it's important. Is we have to remind ourselves we can't be everything to everybody all the time. And I think that's what I mean by when I talk about recognizing our limitations. We can't be the NP, the nice person all the time, thinking that we can save the world. It's not possible. We can do the very best we can to do that, but it's just simply not possible. And there's something to be said about where we go beyond our own limitations, which of course affect us emotionally. And that, I think, is part and parcel of that burnout. It's part and parcel of being angry. It's part and parcel of being depressed. And I hope if there are doctors listening that you take that on board, because I think it is fundamental to what we're talking about here, Chris. Do you want me to continue, sir?
Yes, I'm realizing because we're coming up to questions and answer time.
Yes, yes.
But it means I have to go into the chats to have a look at the questions, which makes me slightly pull away from the conversation I'm having with you. But they look there's a lot of very interesting, important questions. Are you able to access them, Mike?
I'm seeing lots of questions here. What I would suggest that you do is, look, I think people are probably quite enjoying themselves. I think we've got 49 people. Or 46 people there. I'm hoping that people are enjoying themselves, and if they are, I think people need to do that kind of thumbs up thing. And also, if Andrew can see if we can continue for a little while longer. Otherwise, I'm happy to go to the questions. Not an issue.
Hi guys. I will send some questions over to Chris. Just to start some of the conversation. We've got a list of maybe about 5 or 6 questions that I've put together. So, Chris, if I feed you the questions and then you can start one by one.
Sure.
Well, before we do that, Andrew, do you want me just to finish what I was saying, Chris, and then we can throw ourselves into that?
No, because I think it would be good to do that, and then let's go into the question and answer, because that would sort of.
Cool.
Okay.
So, a couple of the other things that I want to say in terms of self-care has to do with, if you think about how empathetic and compassionate doctors and nurses can be, they're unbelievably empathetic and compassionate to others. But at the same time, and the question is, how empathetic and how compassionate are they to themselves? And I think that's an important ingredient in terms of self-regulation and self-reliance and self-care. And I don't know what your view is, but I feel quite strongly about that. They tend to, because they're overachievers, they tend to give themselves a hard time as well.
I was still sort of staying or struck just by that comment you made about doctors that you've worked with who have it. If I understand rightly, you're saying that you're quite struck by their lack of self-esteem, self-worth.
You're struck by that because.
We just wanted something. I suppose there's a classic idea of doctors being very in charge, very sort of. Authoritative, and I suppose the role that they have to take is very much presenting as people who are confident and know what they're talking about and thinking, and that they know what the next step is. And you've sort of opened a different front of, and maybe that's partly why there's such high burnout, or the level. Yeah.
Yes, I'm glad you come. Just reinforce what I said. There's a lot of people kind of about what you do, and we can't do the fact that doctors and nurses are not doing what they do because they've jumped so many hoops over so many years. It doesn't mean they value themselves, they love themselves, that they appreciate themselves, that they respect themselves. It doesn't mean that they see themselves as having value in the world. A lot of individuals that I work with, never mind doctors, have very low self-esteem. And I also see there's a connection between high levels of stress and low self-esteem, high levels of anger and low self-esteem. That's why, part and parcel of what I'm talking about here is when you prioritize yourself, when you learn to say no, when you recognize your limitations and you respect those limitations, that is part and parcel of building self-esteem. When you know what you need and you articulate your needs and you take care of your needs, that is part and parcel of self-esteem. It's in the context of the work that I do as an academic specialist. And so there is something to be said about being able to recognize and understand and make more sense of why it is that we do what we do. And just another cool comment is, I remember I spoke to somebody and they said to me, tell me your profession and I will tell you your wound. Tell me your profession and I'll tell you what your wound is. Now, if you think about doctors, nurses, people in the health and care profession, they know how to take care of others. But the question is, do they know how to take care of themselves? You've just given me a disturbing statistic, 80% of burnout. Crazy. And thank God your charity exists.
So, I mean, part of what it's a very particular time with the COVID. I mean, in 10, 15 minutes, we're all going to go and clap for the NHS workers. And yet, I also know that there's a lot of hostility to doctors, to health workers, and so on. In this particular time, it's possibly romanticized or idealized, but nonetheless, it's still working with people who are vulnerable, frightened, scared. They're not necessarily going to be the easiest people to work with. I'm talking about patients. And then how do doctors self-care in response, reaction to that sort of relationship, which must happen again and again and again?
Somebody just said to me, Mike, we cannot hear you. Is that true, everybody? You cannot hear me?
Well, occasionally you went.
I drop out, do I?
You dropped out for 20 seconds or so, and I just you came back. But it's happened a few times. If it happens again, I'll let you know, Mike.
Yeah, just raise your hand. Chris, can you just ask that question again?
Well, it's how do doctors work with patients who are aggressive or hostile? Because to me, that's also part of standing in the fire, is having to deal with people, who are frightened, vulnerable, angry, very emotional in themselves, demand, expect, need things, and may not necessarily communicate or express it in a way that's going to be particularly useful for sort of a collaborative kind of relationship. But how do you have thoughts or ideas about how? I mean, that alone is going to be very stressful for people. But any thoughts, any ideas about?
So, look, I mean, you're right into the kind of the heart of my work. One of the things I saw that, man. Thanks very much. One of the things that I see as absolutely fundamental here is and great question, because it's helped me to make a connection with this idea of disassociation. Mm-hmm. Part of my response to you is this, that in order to manage that level of intensity, one of the things we have to do, as I said before, is to disassociate, to disconnect from feeling. The other thing that we have to do is we have to train ourselves to not take it personally. That's what we have to do. And within the context of anger management, one of the rules of anger management is don't take anything personally. Now, I can imagine the next question you're going to ask me is, well, how do we do that?
Yeah.
Okay. So this goes back to low self-esteem. And there's a fantastic book on the subject, folks. If you want to read it, I highly recommend it. What is suggested in a book called Don't Take Anything Personally, the writer, the author, suggests that every time we take something personally, what it does, it re-stimulates a negative core belief. Now, a negative core belief is, I'm a failure, I'm useless, I'm a bad person, I'm a horrible person, I shouldn't have been born, I'm unlovable. So it reactivates these negative core beliefs. Those are classic negative core beliefs. Of course, none of those core beliefs are true. But if we never investigate those negative core beliefs, they keep rearing their ugly head. So what will happen is when you take something personally, unconsciously, those thoughts come into our head, all directly linked to low self-esteem. What we have to do is we have to challenge those thoughts. So, for example, if Chris, you had to say to me, for example, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Okay, now I can take it personally because I'm so invested in presenting myself as an authority, and I'm so invested in getting a positive strokes and seeking approval from you. And on the basis of that, what I do with that information is I take that information, I ask myself, what does that make it mean to me? That I don't know what it is that I'm talking about. And if I really deconstruct, what does it mean to me? What do I mean to me? I can isolate, I can pull out what is called a negative core belief. And my negative core belief is however hard I try, I'm not good enough, which equates to me being a failure. That is a negative core belief. So if there's an emotional investment in you liking me or loving me or me seeking your approval or wanting the approval of this particular client group that we're presenting to right now, I'm gonna feel either embarrassed or I'm gonna feel ashamed, and I can either withdraw from the conversation or I can react. Mm-hmm. And so that's part and parcel of what I think that members of the NHS have had to do in order to deal with a lot of the challenges that they're dealing with on an ongoing capacity. And by the way, I don't think this is just from the patients. I don't think this is just from members of the public or the patients' relatives. I think they get a lot of heat from the administrators, from the politics, and from workers who are also trying to do their best, but not as efficient as they could be because they're also running on empty. So I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. But as always, it sort of raises more questions. Does that then could that be a contributory factor to people disassociating?
That's what I was saying. That's the connection I made.
Yeah.
Because it's so painful. So not only am I dealing with the fact that I couldn't save your life, but I use that information, that data. What else could I have done? And I use that data, that information to beat myself up. And in order to stop beating myself up, I disassociate. I mean, I would love to know whether that's true for doctors and nurses that might be listening right now. I wonder whether they go to that place.
Well, we sort of moved into the question and answer period. And I haven't been able to get any of the. Maybe you could you get involved in, because you can actually look at the questions. Could you sort of share with us some of the questions?
Hi, yes, of course I can do that for you.
Some great questions.
So some of the questions that we've had, I'll take one from Johnny. He said, "Hi guys, great talk. A question on anger management and night shifts. Sleep deprivation is tough, but working at 100% on a night shift can be very tough. I know all of us, me included, can get a bit short-tempered when we get a bleep at 4 a.m. whilst on no sleep on a night shift. Do you have any quick tactics on managing sleep deprived and short temper?" So I guess that's in conjunction to long nights, but having to be focused. What would you recommend? Mike, Chris?
Do you want to go ahead, Chris? And I'll
no, I was going to follow up.
Oh, right. You want me to respond
first?
Okay. First of all, Johnny, thanks for that. It's a great question. I tell you what it reminds me of. In AA, they talk about the HALT process: hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Chris. I've just added an S on the end, and stressed. So HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, tired, and stressed. And that is so fundamental within the context of the work that I do. And I keep reminding people they have to be aware when they're hungry, when they're lonely, when they're tired, and when they're stressed. And of course, when they're angry, that's a combination of hunger and anger. That is when they get, their behavior becomes extreme. And of course, that's when they act out with addiction. So, once again, Johnny, my view is that we have to prioritize ourselves. That's the perspective that I take. I have to acknowledge and recognize my limitations. I have to make myself a priority in order to take care of myself. Otherwise, it's impossible to even do what I'm suggesting to do. And then I think we do have to take into consideration how we constantly seek approval and constantly look for positive strokes to reinforce how lovable we are, how good we are, or that we are good enough. So there's something to be said, and I hope this is making is clarity for you, John, and everybody else. But there is something about when it comes to low self-esteem, Chris, is that we defer to others for validation and reassurance. And so,
just say that again. We defer to others.
Defer to others for validation and reassurance.
And what is in these situations we're referring to? What would be deferring?
Okay. So, you say to me, so you're a senior doctor and I'm a junior doctor, and you said to me, Mike, we're understaffed. Can you put in an extra 2 hours? And because I desperately need your validation, I say yes. Why wouldn't I say yes? If people are deeply ill and dying, why wouldn't I say yes? But there is something to be said about what I do is I'm desperate for the positive stroke. You say to me, Chris, my God, Mike, you're the man. I can always rely on you. You've always got my back. But what do I do then? I take the positive stroke and then I go home and I act my anger out towards my wife, and who acts their anger out towards the kids. And of course, the kids, they kick the cat. So I get the positive stroke here, but I get the kick up the arse at home. You're not going to know that.
Is there an alternative to that? I mean, because we're creatures of instant gratification. I mean, we're drawn to the immediate sort of feel good, and the consequences come later. But is there an alternative way in which you would approach that sort of question?
Now we're kind of moving to the realms of politics, and we both agreed we're not going to get caught up in the politics of the situation. But the fact is that the NHS is understaffed. I mean, we do not want to get into it, so I don't want you to take this. It's understaffed and it is underfinanced. So if the NHS was not understaffed and underfinanced, there'd be more than enough doctors to go around, there'd be more than enough funding to go around, and you wouldn't have to ask me, can I stay on for an extra 2 hours? Because of course I'm compelled, I'm driven. That's how I'm trained. So I'm going to say yes, because I know that if I don't say yes, it's going to be a consequence. Somebody could die. But also, you've already mentioned the burnout statistic of 80%. So if I get the positive stroke from you, I feel really great about myself for about 2 hours. Then I go home and I've got to deal with the fallout there. You said you were going to be on time. You committed you were going to be in time.
I mean, this is why we need 3 hours. This is why we need 3 hours, because we're going to go. But let's try and go back to some of the questions so that we can try and answer some specifics. Ange, have you got another question we could look at?
I do. I'm just conscious that we're going to be clapping for carers in sort of
5 minutes.
5 minutes, but we'll squeeze a question in. If you don't answer it, we can get back to it post the clapping. Okay, so one from Shazad. When you mentioned you can't see the patient in their humanity, does one lose empathy, or is empathy masked? And is this a sign of apathy, albeit temporary, due to stress? Interesting question.
Yeah, that's yours again, Mike.
Oh no, that's a little unfair, Chris. You dive in the deep end.
That's such a rich question. Say it again, and let me see what I can do with it. Say it again.
One more time, sure. When you mention you can't see the patient in their humanity, does one lose empathy, or is empathy masked? And is this a sign of apathy, albeit temporary due to stress?
Well, it could be that second bit of the sort of question. I think even being able to ask that sort of question puts you in a different position, in the sense that you're already aware of a certain dynamic with a patient, because part of this conversation is sort of the more conscious, the more we can sort of understand the processes, the emotional processes we're going through ourselves, the more we can sort of, in a way, stand outside of it and make some choices and decisions about how we are going to respond to the particular moment that we're in. And I think you can be empathic towards somebody, but it's very much from an observational position, because partly you're going to have to take care of your own feelings, your own emotions in that moment. And it's sort of getting the balance between self-care and still being able to provide something for that person without necessarily needing anything from them. That's a sort of, what do you think of that, Mike?
Listen, I just love what you said, okay? Because one of the other comments that I wanted to mention here is to develop an internal witness. Like a wise person inside of you who can be objective. And I think that's what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Because I think it's fundamental in what you've said. And I hope everyone got that Chris's response, because it was absolutely priceless. We need to develop a witness, a wise person inside of us, because that part of us is able to be objective and subjective at the same time. And it makes it easier to respond accordingly. So, wow, I'm so glad I asked you to go first, Chris. I'm aware of time.
Well, we've got a few minutes. And is there a question that you could ask or just share with us, which we could lead straight back into after the clapping?
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about dissociation a couple of times. I just wonder if you looked at the question from Sean, which said, I see the disassociation with feelings with my wife, who is a nurse and working in a COVID ITU ward, and the behavior is then brought home. And I just wondered, this conversation, when you have husband and wives that work in the same field or are first responders, and a couple of questions have come through about how do you manage behaviors when you're at home if you're both dealing with similar issues in your work environment during this time?
Yeah.
Sorry,
Anne.
I was going to say how, everyone if you're a first responder, the stresses are similar, but, how do you neutralize and normalize that home environment perhaps? And Chris, you've been talking about this in our previous huddle sessions where we've been speaking to doctors. So maybe that would be of value here.
I mean, it was something that I was sort of remembering actually, because people are also going back to their domestic settings. I mean, either they might live on their own or with partners or families. People might also work in the field themselves, may not. And the additional stresses of that, both commonality of experiences or differences, being able to share or not, sort of not really feeling able to talk because you want to protect or care for your own family or partner. Just that part of how you self-care when relationships are so important, but they can add more complications to how you take care of yourself and also bring more rewards.
Chris, I would like to just include Manuela, who who's so much part of the organisation, the British Association of Angling, and she says some really interesting things. She has a background as a therapist. She's a cranial psychotherapist, and she's a wise being. So she says something like, a couple of things we need to do is to breathe out, and she knows about this stuff, okay? So breathe out for longer. Breathe out for longer, and slower calms the body. Breathe out for longer, and slower calms the body. The other thing she says, which is the obvious one, is cut yourself some slack. Give yourself a break. And then she says something also which I find really interesting. She says, I don't know where this comes from, man, but let me see if I can make more sense of it. Yes, but they can't, except if they recognize the state they are in, rather than deny it, shifts the internal process. Then they can implement the whole process. So that's what she's talking about, the whole process.
Implement the whole
process. Yes. Okay. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired, and stressed. So in order to implement the whole process, we've got to recognize that we're already in the red zone. Because the whole process is experienced as an act of self-care or an act of self-soothing, not a suppression. So I don't know if that made any sense to you, but I can clean it up. Oh, yes, she said yes. Okay. So there's something about we have to recognize when we are acting out. And this comes back to the question that you responded to, Chris, which is around that we do need to develop an internal witness who doesn't experience the overwhelm that we experience. And in order to do that, then we have access to choices like, halting as opposed to acting out.
Is there a way is there a way to bring that into being? Do you have your own suggestions to people as to how to cultivate a sort of
awareness?
So what would you have to be aware of?
Well, look, in my work, I just bang on about mindfulness practices. I bang on about staying connected to your feelings. Recognize what you're feeling, what you're feeling. Observe your feelings. When people ask you, how are you? Tell them how you feel rather than fine, all right, okay, good, better, not bad. So it's partly that process is about tuning to fit your feelings. And the other part of this is like slowing everything down. And when I talk about slowing everything down, I'm talking about being able to get to a still point that you blend with the observer. And by blending with the observer, you have access to making choices. And when I talk about making choices, recognizing what is unhealthy for me and recognizing what is healthy for me. The only way that I can do that is when I'm not in an adrenalized state. Yoga, meditation, mindfulness practices, being aware of my breath, noticing what's happening in my body, noticing my thoughts, not taking the thoughts that I notice and then using those thoughts against me, finding a way of accessing kindness towards myself, being empathetic. Manuela says, cutting myself some slack. I think that's all part and parcel of it. So that is probably, that's the way that I teach how to do that. But I do think the mindfulness practice is an important piece here. It's all about what does it mean to be present? What does it mean to live in the here and now without continuously distracting ourselves?
I mean, one thing that I get when I talk about normalizing things and getting ahead of the curve, is it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be scared, frustrated, irritated, not to the point that you then act it out or that you go into reaction, but it's perfectly normal to have those feelings. I mean, it's just from my own personal experience, it's just obvious to go and do meditation or do exercise and so forth, but it can so often also feel like another pressure, or I'm not going to do it right, or I'm going to get it wrong, or I'd rather just watch terrible TV or eat something junk food and so forth. Just how you get the balance between those things.
Chris, I am within the context of anger management. One of the themes that emerge is being able to experience the full democracy of our feelings. And there is a distinction between a feeling and an emotion. And I'm very clear that there is a distinction between a feeling and an emotion. So it's about embracing the full democracy of our feelings in order not to rationalize our feelings. And I know this is part of a conversation that we had 2 weeks ago, how often people rationalize their feelings rather than feel them. And I find that irritating because I spend most of my life rationalizing my feelings, justifying why I feel the way I feel. And I don't need to justify the way I feel. That, even within the context of anger, when I feel angry, I don't have to justify why I feel angry. That's how I'm feeling. I don't have to justify to you why I'm feeling happy. So why do I have to justify to you why I'm feeling angry? I'm feeling angry. The problem, of course, is when I act out my anger, that's when it becomes an issue. So there is something to be said about part and parcel of what it means to be fully present is constantly checking with our feelings. And it's an easy thing to do. The way we do that is when somebody asks you, how are you? You can say to them, fine, okay, or right. That's okay. But maybe you need to check in with yourself and then ask yourself, well, how are you feeling? And I don't know if you remember, Andrew, because when you asked me, how am I told you I was feeling happy and relaxed. I make a point of being authentic around what it is that I'm feeling. And it gives me the opportunity to check in with that. So, within the context of the NHS, I of course, I want to encourage doctors to tune into their feelings. They might not want to necessarily express it to others, but at least create space for the feeling that they're feeling. And I think it's important because if I can just bring another dimension into this, is that I have a view that there is a distinction and difference between stress and saturation. I've been saturated, but I've not acted my anger out. And I've been stressed, and I have acted my anger out. So for me, saturation is when I'm so full up to the brim, but I recognize that I'm full up. The issue with stress, of course, is that when I'm stressed, it usually equates to being regressed. And when I'm regressed, I'm no longer in the present. So when I'm saturated, I am full up, but I'm very much in the present. And I can make a choice about how I want to manage that level of saturation. And I think there's a beautiful distinction between the two. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just take stress and use it as a tool for transformation? So the work of Kelly McGonigal, do you know Kelly McGonigal's work, Chris?
No.
She does this amazing reframe on stress. And for those of you listening, Kelly McGonigal, she did a presentation on TED, and I think you'd absolutely love it. Because she's done all the research that by actually embracing stress and seeing stress as positive, you can actually add an extra 10 years to your life. And that's the research that was done. So it's been proven scientifically based on the research. So
I think we've identified the talk you're going to give next month, Mike.
Oh, okay.
Well, this. You've gone again. And while Mike's gone off, have you got another question that we could sort of get in before we have to finish?
Yes. Just give me a second.
We might have possibly completely lost Mike.
No, I'm still here.
Are you back?
I'm still here. Yeah.
I was just when you got cut off for a few seconds there, Mike. I was just seeing if we could squeeze in another question before we have to complete this evening's conversation.
Yeah. Give me 1 second.
Let me go through those questions as well.
I think you've actually answered quite a lot of the questions as you've been talking.
Yeah. I mean, just with the last few minutes, what would you say were the key points of what we've talked about tonight, Mike?
Well, look, I tell you what jumps out at me, Chris, and I you know, when I threw the question back at you, and you in a way answered a question for me, which is the importance of the internal witness, being able to observe myself. And I do think that when you're working in such high levels of stress and anxiety and trauma, somehow I think it's fundamental that we access the witness. And in order to do that, we have to be able to slow everything down, be aware of our breath, as Manuel has already said, and find a way of creating calm, tranquility, and silence inside of our own heads without disassociating, without disconnecting, without being unkind to ourselves and to others. So that's really, and I feel quite moved when I talk about it, actually, because I do think that is an amazing resource that we have access to anyway, but it's about recognizing that we have access to that resource and cultivating it.
I mean, I think literally just this conversation, I mean, YouOkayDoc was set up, I mean, to provide services, emotional and mental health services to doctors. And I think part of it is literally just having these conversations, that the more we normalize these sort of discussions, the more that they're just, why wouldn't you have these conversations? And that also what comes from that in terms of services, in terms of conversations, in terms of deeper understanding of how these things work, how we can actually bring feedback from people who doctors, feedback from them that we can actually use to influence policy, whether it's political, clinical, but just for their own benefit, really, their own well-being. I believe passionately, if doctors are emotionally more positive emotionally, and they have better mental health, that will also in turn help us as a society, as a country. So I think literally just having this conversation, I think it's a great title, Mark. Keep calling me Mark.
Yeah, you can call me whatever
with kindness. It's such a great title, and that it gives us an opportunity to go off in so many different directions. What were you going to say?
Well, just let me respond to that. I mean, I hope you expected that, based on the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, because we did go off in some directions and kind of came back to, the central conversation. There is another question there, Chris, which is, what do you think about the idea that there is a difference between experience and expressing a feeling? And often people jump straight to expressing without really feeling them. Did that make sense?
Yeah, but you're going to answer that one.
Okay, I've got to make sure the question is. So what do you think about the idea that there is a difference between an experience and expressing a feeling? And often people jump straight to expressing without really feeling them. Well, whoever that question came from, that's pretty cool. So let me, another favorite subject of mine. And I see we still got 36 participants hanging out with us, or 33 participants. So thank you for staying with us. I really appreciate that. So once again, in the context of my work, brilliant question, whoever that came from, absolutely brilliant question. I talk about one of the big triggers for our anger is that when somebody invalidates my experience, it's a trigger for anger. And there is a difference between an experience and a feeling. So what will happen, example, Chris, what will happen is you and I are going for a walk. And before going for a walk, you say to me, Mike, take a jacket, it's going to get cold. I say to you, Chris, don't worry about that. I'm okay, mate. Okay. So now we're walking. There's a point halfway through the walk, I say to you, well, Chris, it's really cold, isn't it? You look at me as if I've gone nuts. Your response to me is, what are you talking about? I told you to bring a jacket. Why don't you just simply listen to me? That's an example of having my experience invalidated. What is it that I want? Actually, I'd like you just to listen without commenting, or if you're going to comment, at least be empathetic rather than impatient and unkind. What I'd like to hear is, I'm sorry to hear that, Mike. Do you want to run? Do you want to take a cab? Do you want to share my jacket? So what will happen, I'll log that in my head, because what you've done is you've invalidated my experience, which then triggers the feeling. I'll then hold a resentment, a grudge against you. So what happens that evening? We go for dinner after the walk. You have a biscuit and a piece of bread, and I have this massive steak, chips, and salad. Now we're on our way back home. Yeah? On our way back home, you say, God, I'm really feeling hungry. I look at you as if you're completely nuts. And I say, what are you talking about, Chris? You had a massive meal. And then you remind me, actually, Mike, I didn't. I had a soup and a slice of bread. So that's the reaction, rather than validating your experience. And because you didn't validate my experience, well, stuff you. I'm not going to validate your experience. If you take any angry situation, there's two key components. One is having my experience validated by someone telling me I'm wrong. I shouldn't have said that. That was really bad. And the other one is not having my needs acknowledged or met. And it feels like that's a pretty cool place to end, Chris. I don't know what your view is.
No, I think that's an excellent way to end today. Mike, thank you very much for. You're the first of many speakers, but it's been fantastic that you've been the first speaker. Just to reiterate, Mike has offered his presence for free tonight, which is amazing. So thank you, Mike, for that, because I know that your time is valuable. Just to sort of say, if you're interested in working with Mike or want to look more at his work, BAAM, British Association of Anger Management, the website. He's also the author of Beating Anger and Mindfulness and the Art of Managing Anger. I think I got that right, Mike.
Yes, yes.
I've read both of them, really very valuable, full of useful insight and information and exercises. And just to remind people that there's a series of speakers starting in June. Again, we've got some amazing speakers. Julia Samuels, who wrote Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass. Caroline Webb, How to Have a Good Day. A very good, well-known coach. And Mike, again, Mike will be coming back in June with a different subject, but I'm sure there'll be lots of overlaps to the conversation tonight. So thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. And to everybody who signed in and has stayed with us tonight, thank you. Welcome to YouOkayDoc Charity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks.